Hi everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in, get cozy, and relax with me. Let's start. Sarah and I had always dreamed of owning a Victorian house. When we found the listing for 47 Maple Street, with its weathered gables and wraparound porch, it seemed too good to be true. The price was well within our budget, suspiciously so, looking back, and the realtor was eager to close the deal. Perhaps we should have questioned why such a magnificent property was priced so modestly, but love has a way of clouding judgment. The house stood at the end of a quiet street in a small New England town, its faded blue paint peeling like old memories ready to be shed. Towering oak trees flanked the property, their branches creating intricate shadows that danced across the lawn. The previous owners had left abruptly, we were told, due to a job relocation. Their furniture still occupied some rooms, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered when we first walked through the creaking front door. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the original hardwood floors, the ornate crown molding, and the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. I had to agree. It was everything we'd hoped for in our first home together. The moving process was straightforward enough. We spent the first few days painting walls, replacing light fixtures, and making the space our own. The house seemed to respond positively to our presence, as if awakening from a long slumber. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the rooms and casting golden patterns on the walls. It was during our first week that we discovered the journal. Sarah was cleaning out the built-in bookshelf in the study when she found it wedged behind a loose panel. The leather-bound book was weathered, its pages yellow with age. Inside, dated entries spanning from 1987 to 1988 detailed the experiences of a previous owner, Elizabeth Chun. "Listen to this," Sarah said, perching on the window seat. "October 15th, 1987. The music box in the attic played again today. I know I didn't wind it. James says I'm imagining things, but I know what I heard. The melody is always the same, a lullaby I can't quite place." I shrugged it off as the imaginings of a previous owner, but Sarah became fascinated with Elizabeth's writings. She spent evenings poring over the journal, occasionally reading passages aloud that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elizabeth wrote about cold spots that appeared and disappeared, about objects that moved on their own, and about dreams that felt more like memories of events she'd never experienced. The first incident we couldn't explain happened 3 weeks after we moved in. I was working late in the study, grading papers for my high school English class, when I heard piano music drifting up from the first floor. The notes were hesitant, like someone picking out a melody they half remembered. I assumed Sarah was playing on the old upright in the living room, though I didn't know she could play. When I went downstairs to investigate, the living room was empty. The piano stood silent, its yellowed keys untouched. Sarah was already in bed, reading. "I thought you were playing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her book, confused. "I don't play piano. You know that." We both heard the music after that, always late at night, always the same fragmentary melody. Sometimes it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, though we never saw anyone. Sarah began to document our experiences in her own journal, drawing parallels between what was happening to us and what Elizabeth had written about 30 years earlier. The dreams started next. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left us both unsettled. In mine, I was always searching for something in the house. Opening doors, looking under furniture, checking behind walls. I never knew what I was looking for, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. Sarah's dreams were more specific. She dreamed of a young woman in a blue dress, sitting at the piano, endlessly practicing the same piece of music. One morning, Sarah woke up crying. "She's so sad," she said when I asked what was wrong. "She's been waiting so long." "Who has?" "Emily, the girl in the blue dress." I hadn't told Sarah about my research, but I'd been digging into the house's history. There had been an Emily Sullivan, the daughter of the house's original owners. She died in 1912 at the age of 19. According to newspaper archives, she'd been a promising pianist who died under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that she was found at the piano. Sheet music for an unfinished composition spread before her. The activity in the house intensified after that. Objects would move when we weren't looking. We'd find all the doors open in the morning, though we'd closed them the night before. The piano music became louder, more insistent. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs, their footsteps urgent and heavy. Sarah became convinced that Emily was trying to communicate with us. She started leaving sheet music on the piano, hoping to encourage some kind of interaction. I remained skeptical, but I couldn't deny that something strange was happening in our home. The turning point came on a cold November night. We'd been in the house for 2 months, and the activity had reached a fever pitch. The piano music had been playing for hours, louder than ever before. Sarah sat in the living room, watching the keys move on their own, while I paced nervously behind her. Suddenly, the music stopped. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we could see our breath in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on a point near the piano. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence, something old and sad and desperate to be heard. "She wants to finish it," Sarah whispered. "The composition. She never got to finish it." What happened next defies explanation. Sarah walked to the piano and sat down. Though she'd never played before, her fingers found the keys with certainty. The melody that emerged was the same one we'd been hearing for weeks, but this time it continued past the point where it usually stopped. Sarah played for nearly an hour, her hands moving as if guided by an invisible force. When she finished, she was crying, but smiling. "It's done," she said simply. "She can rest now." The house felt different after that night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the strange occurrences gradually ceased. We still hear the piano occasionally, but it's distant now, like an echo of a memory. The song Sarah played that night, Emily's final composition, was eventually published. Music scholars were fascinated by its complexity and emotional depth. We've lived in the house for 5 years now. We've made peace with its history and its mysteries. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, we sit in the living room and listen for echoes of the past. The house has taught us that not all hauntings are malevolent. Sometimes they're just unfinished stories, waiting for the right people to help tell them. Sarah still has Elizabeth Chin's journal, and she's added her own volumes to it. Sometimes new owners of old houses write to us, sharing their own inexplicable experiences. We tell them what we've learned, that history doesn't always rest quietly, that music can bridge the gap between past and present, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen to the stories our homes are trying to tell us. Last week, we found a note written in unfamiliar handwriting on the piano. "Thank you for listening." The paper was yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh. Sarah framed it and hung it above the piano. A reminder that some mysteries don't need to be solved to be understood. We've talked about moving. The house is getting a bit small now that we're expecting our first child, but something always holds us back. Maybe it's the thought of leaving Emily, though we sense she's at peace now. Or maybe it's because we've learned that home isn't just about the living space we create in the present. It's also about the echoes of all the lives that came before us, the stories embedded in the walls, and the music that lingers in the air long after the last note has faded away. Sometimes, late at night, I think I see a young woman in a blue dress sitting at the piano. She never plays anymore. She doesn't need to. Her story has been told, her music completed. But she stays, a gentle guardian of the house and its memories, reminding us that every home has its own symphony of stories, if only we take the time to listen.
I never wanted to take the night shift at Silver Pine Lodge. The pay was better, sure, but something about working alone in that massive old building, perched on the edge of the wilderness, always felt wrong. But bills needed paying, and beggars can't be choosers, especially not in a small town like Pine Haven where jobs were as scarce as sunshine in December. The lodge itself was beautiful during the day, a masterpiece of rustic architecture with its towering stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding forest. But at night, those same windows became like black mirrors, reflecting the dim interior lights and making it impossible to see what might be lurking in the darkness beyond. My job was simple enough: Maintain the building's systems during the off-season winter months when the lodge was closed to guests. Check the boilers, monitor the security cameras, and make sure nothing froze or broke. The owner, Mr. Harrison, was paranoid about pipes bursting or animals getting in, so he paid good money to keep someone on site every night from October through March. That particular night started like any other. I arrived just as the maintenance day shift was leaving, exchanging quick pleasantries with Mike, the daytime caretaker. He mentioned something about strange noises coming from the east wing, but we both brushed it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling in the cold. Probably just the wind, he said, zipping up his heavy winter coat. But maybe check the windows in that section. Make sure nothing's loose. I nodded, already thinking about the long night ahead. 12 hours alone in a building big enough to house 200 guests, with nothing but the hum of heating systems and the occasional ping of radiators for company. I'd done it hundreds of times before, but something felt different that night. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the trees, or how the snow seemed to fall in unusual patterns, swirling and dancing like it was being orchestrated by some unseen force. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made my initial rounds, checking all the major systems and marking everything down in the logbook. The east wing was quiet, no unusual noises, though I did notice that one of the thermostats was reading slightly lower than it should have been. I adjusted it and made a note to have Mike check it in the morning. Around midnight, I settled into the security office with a cup of coffee and my tablet. The office was my favorite spot in the lodge, a small room near the main entrance with monitors showing feeds from all 36 security cameras. It made me feel less alone, being able to see every major area of the building at once. Plus, it was the warmest room, thanks to all the electronics. I was halfway through an article about urban legends in the area when I first noticed something odd on one of the monitors. Camera 12, which covered the main hallway of the east wing, showed a brief flicker of movement. It was so quick I almost missed it, just a shadow passing through the frame. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there. Must have been a glitch in the system. But then it happened again, this time on camera 15, which monitored the grand staircase. Another shadow, moving too fast to be natural, like someone running past the camera at impossible speed. My heart started beating faster as I checked all the monitors more carefully. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. The air in the small office seemed heavier, colder, despite the warmth from the equipment. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, standard issue for all-night staff, and decided to do another round of checks. The hallways seemed longer than usual, the shadows deeper. My footsteps echoed off the wooden floors, each sound sending little jolts of anxiety through my spine. The east wing thermometer was now reading 10 degrees lower than it had been an hour ago, despite the heating system running at full capacity. As I stood there checking the thermostat, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, coming from one of the guest rooms down the hall. The sound stopped abruptly when I turned my head toward it. I stood perfectly still, listening, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. "Is someone there?" No response, just the usual ambient noises of the building. I keyed my radio, thinking about calling Mike or even local security, but what would I say? That I heard a noise? That I was spooked by shadows on security cameras? They'd laugh it off, tell me to grow up. Besides, I'd signed up for this job knowing I'd be alone. I decided to check the room where I'd heard the noise. It was standard procedure to investigate any unusual sounds. Usually it turned out to be a broken window letting in wind, or a small animal that had somehow found its way inside. Room 237 was dark and cold, much colder than it should have been. My flashlight beam revealed nothing out of the ordinary. A perfectly made bed, drawn curtains, the usual hotel room furniture all covered in white sheets for the off-season. But something caught my eye, a mark on the hardwood floor, near the bathroom door. I moved closer, crouching down to examine it. It looked like a scratch, fresh and deep, as if something with considerable strength had dug into the wood. As I examined it, I noticed more scratches, forming a trail that led into the bathroom. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to run back to the security office and call for help. But I had a job to do. If something was damaging the property, I needed to know what it was. I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. The bathroom was pitch black, my flashlight beam seeming to get swallowed by the darkness. As I pushed the door open wider, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, forming little clouds in the beam of light. The mirror above the sink was completely fogged over, despite the bone-dry air. Then I saw it, or rather, I saw them. More scratches, dozens of them, covering the walls in chaotic patterns. They looked fresh, the exposed with still light in color where whatever had made them had torn through the wallpaper. Some of them formed shapes that looked almost like letters, but in no alphabet I'd ever seen. A sound behind me made me spin around, something between a whisper and a hiss, coming from back in the bedroom. My flashlight beam darted around, searching for the source, but found nothing. The door to the hallway was now closed, though I was certain I'd left it open. I reached for the door handle, trying to keep my hand steady. It was ice cold to the touch, and for a moment, I thought I saw something dark move across the fogged mirror in my peripheral vision. The handle wouldn't turn. I tried again, harder this time, but it was like it was frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from all around me now. My flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing weaker. In the failing light, I saw something start to appear in the fog on the mirror, lines being drawn by an invisible hand, forming what looked like a face, but wrong somehow, distorted and inhuman. The flashlight died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard something move behind me, accompanied by a sound like dry leaves scratching against wood. The air grew even colder, and I felt something brush against my back. Something that felt like fingers, but too long, too cold to be human. Pure instinct took over. I slammed my shoulder into the door as hard as I could. Once, twice, 3 times until it finally burst open. I ran, not daring to look back, my feet somehow finding their way through the darkness. The whispers followed me, along with that horrible scratching sound, growing louder and faster. I made it back to the security office in record time, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I pulled it out to call Mike. But before I could dial, I glanced at the monitors and felt my heart stop. Every camera in the East Wing was showing the same thing, static and darkness, except for camera 12. There, in the grainy footage, I could clearly see a figure standing in the hallway, tall and impossibly thin, its body bent at unnatural angles. It was looking directly at the camera, and even through the poor quality of the video feed, I could see that its face was exactly like the one that had been drawn in the fog on the mirror. The figure raised one long-fingered hand and seemed to wave at the camera. Then, one by one, all the monitors went dark. The office lights flickered and died, leaving me in complete darkness. My phone screen went black, despite being fully charged moments ago. In the darkness, I heard the office door handle slowly begin to turn. I'd like to say I stayed to face whatever was trying to get in, but I didn't. I had a spare key to the maintenance exit in my pocket, and I used it. I ran out into the snowy night and didn't stop until I reached my car. The engine started on the first try, thank God for small mercies, and I sped away from Silver Pine Lodge as fast as I dared on the icy roads. I called Mike from the road, once my phone mysteriously started working again. He went to check the lodge with the police, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. No scratches on the floors or walls, no malfunctioning cameras, no signs of any disturbance at all. The temperature readings were all normal, and the security footage showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and dark rooms. Mr. Harrison was surprisingly understanding when I quit the next day. In fact, he didn't seem shocked at all. He just nodded slowly and said something that still haunts me. It usually takes them longer to notice. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. I drove past Silver Pine Lodge yesterday, during daylight hours. It looked perfectly normal, beautiful even, with fresh snow covering the grounds and smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. But I noticed they're hiring again for the night shift position. The pay is even better now. Sometimes I wonder about the poor soul who took my place, alone in that building at night. I wonder if they've heard the whispers yet, or seen the shadows moving in the cameras. I wonder if they've noticed how the East Wing grows colder as the night progresses, or how the mirrors fog over even when the air is dry. But mostly, I wonder about what Mr. Harrison meant by them and how many others before me had seen what I saw in room 237. How many others had run from that thing with the distorted face and long, cold fingers? How many others had discovered that sometimes the most frightening things aren't the ghosts or monsters we imagine might be hiding in the darkness? Sometimes, the most frightening things are the ones that have always been there, patiently waiting in places we thought we knew, watching us through cameras we thought were keeping us safe, waiting for us to finally notice them. I still work night shifts now, but at a 24-hour diner in town. The pay isn't as good, and the hours are just as lonely, but at least here, the only things watching me through the windows are the occasional deer and maybe some late-night truckers looking for coffee. And if I sometimes think I see something tall and thin walking through the parking lot, or notice strange scratches appearing on the bathroom mirrors, well, I just turn up the radio and tell myself it's all in my head. But I keep my car keys close, just in case. And I never, ever look too long at the security cameras.
Being a subway train operator on the midnight shift wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but I had grown to appreciate the solitude. The pay was decent, and there was something oddly peaceful about guiding my train through the underground tunnels of the city while most people were asleep. At least, that's what I used to think before that night changed everything. I had been working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift on the Blue Line for almost 3 years. It was the least popular route, running through some of the oldest parts of the city's underground network. The tunnels there dated back to the 1920s, and it showed patches of original brickwork still visible between modern reinforcements, old maintenance walkways that hadn't been used in decades, and side tunnels that led to abandoned platforms from a bygone era. That night started like any other. I arrived at the depot just before midnight, went through the usual equipment checks, and started my first run. The Blue Line wasn't busy during regular hours, let alone at midnight, but the city maintained 24-hour service on all major lines. Most of my passengers were night shift workers, drunk partygoers, or the occasional tourist who had lost track of time. The first few runs were uneventful. Stop, open doors, wait, close doors, continue. The routine was almost meditative. Around 2 a.m., during what would normally be my quietest run, something felt different. The tunnels seemed darker somehow, the familiar shadows deeper and more absolute. The service lights that usually provided a dim glow along the tracks appeared fainter, creating strange patterns of darkness that my brain struggled to process. I had just left Chester Station, heading toward the longest stretch of tunnel on the route, a 2-mile section with no stops that curved deep under the old part of the city. The tunnel here was purely original construction, too narrow for modern safety walkways. Management had been promising to renovate it for years, but budget constraints kept pushing it back. My train was empty except for one passenger, an elderly woman sitting in the middle car. I had noticed her boarding at Chester Station, which was unusual because that station was in a business district, completely deserted at this hour. She had caught my attention because of her old-fashioned clothing, a long, dark dress that seemed more suited to a funeral than late-night travel. As the train entered the long tunnel section, the overhead lights in the cars began to flicker. This wasn't entirely unusual in the older sections of track, where power fluctuations sometimes occurred, but something about it made my skin crawl. Through the CCTV monitor that showed the passenger cars, I noticed the old woman hadn't moved or reacted to the flickering lights. She sat perfectly still, head bowed, hands folded in her lap. The radio crackled to life, making me jump. Instead of the usual clear transmission, I heard only static, punctuated by what sounded like distant voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I checked my signal indicator. It showed full strength, which was impossible in this section of tunnel. We were too deep underground. The flickering in the passenger cars grew worse, and now I could see that the old woman had raised her head. Through the grainy CCTV feed, it looked like she was staring directly at the camera. Something about her face seemed wrong, but the poor quality of the image made it hard to tell exactly what. Then the train's wheels hit something on the track, at least, that's what it felt like. The entire train shuddered, and for a moment, the lights went out completely. When they came back on a second later, the CCTV monitor showed the old woman was gone. My heart started racing. People couldn't just disappear from a moving train. I grabbed the radio to call control, but now it was completely dead, not even static. The tunnel outside seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the beam from the train's headlights swallowed by in darkness that appeared thicker than it should have been. The air in the cabin grew colder, my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. The temperature gauge still showed normal, but I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. The train speed indicator was showing our normal cruising speed of 40 miles per hour, but somehow the tunnel walls seemed to be moving past more slowly than they should have been. That's when I noticed something in the darkness ahead, shapes moving along the tunnel walls. At first, I thought they were shadows cast by the train's headlight, but they were moving in the wrong direction, flowing against the train's movement like dark water running uphill. As I watched, the shapes seemed to become more defined, taking on forms that looked almost human, but elongated and distorted. The radio suddenly burst to life again, but instead of static, I heard what sounded like an old train announcement, the kind they used to make decades ago. Now approaching Ash Street Station. End of the line. All passengers must exit. My blood ran cold. Ash Street Station had been closed and sealed off in 1954 after a terrible accident, a fire that had killed dozens of passengers. The station didn't even appear on modern maps anymore, and I had always assumed it had been demolished during later tunnel renovations. But now, through the darkness ahead, I could see lights appearing. Not the modern LED service lights, but old incandescent bulbs, their yellow glow revealing an approaching platform. The station signs became visible through the gloom. ASH Street Station, written in faded Art Deco lettering. I hit the emergency brakes, but nothing happened. The train continued its steady pace toward the platform. The control panel was completely unresponsive, all the buttons dead under my fingers. Through the windows, I could now see the platform clearly. It looked perfectly preserved, as if the fire had never happened. There were even people standing on it, waiting for the train, but something was wrong about them. Their clothes were old-fashioned, like the woman's had been, and they stood too still, too rigid. As the train drew closer, I could see their faces, or rather, the absence of faces. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, blank skin, like mannequins. Yet somehow, I knew they were all looking at me. The train began to slow down on its own, as if preparing to stop at the platform. The door's activation lights came on, indicating they were preparing to open. In desperation, I tried the emergency door locks, but like everything else, they didn't respond. That's when I heard it, a sound coming from the passenger cars behind me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the driver's cabin. Through the CCTV monitor, I could see a figure walking through the middle car, the old woman, but something was different about her. She moved wrong, her joints bending in impossible ways, and her face was like those of the figures on the platform. The footsteps got closer, and I could hear something else now, a sound like dry paper rustling, or perhaps ancient cloth dragging along the floor. The temperature dropped even further, frost beginning to form on the inside of the windows. The old woman had reached the door to my cabin, and I could hear her hand scraping against it, trying to find the handle. In that moment of pure terror, I remembered something, an old emergency protocol that hadn't been used in years. Every driver's cabin had a manual override lever hidden behind a panel under the main controls. It would disengage all electronic systems and activate the emergency brakes mechanically. The catch was, using it would probably damage the train beyond repair, and any driver who pulled it without a provable emergency would be fired instantly. The door handle began to turn. I ripped open the panel and grabbed the lever, pulling it with all my strength. The effect was immediate and violent. A horrible screech filled the air as the brakes engaged, sparks flying from the wheels. The train shuddered so hard I thought it would derail. I was thrown against the control panel, my head hitting something hard. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the cabin. The emergency lights were on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. Through the windows, I could see regular service lights in the tunnel, modern LED ones. The radio was working again, filled with concerned voices from control asking about my status. The train had stopped about half a mile from the next station. When the emergency response team reached me, they found all the train systems had been completely fried by the emergency brake activation. The CCTV recordings were corrupted, showing only static. There was no sign of any passenger having been on the train, and no trace of Ash Street Station, just the same curved tunnel walls I'd passed hundreds of times before. The official investigation concluded that I had experienced a stress-induced hallucination, possibly caused by carbon dioxide buildup in the tunnel section. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence of anything unusual happening, and the train's data recorder showed normal operation until I pulled the emergency lever. I was suspended for 2 weeks and required to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before returning to work. The doctor suggested that years of working the night shift had affected my sleep patterns, leading to an episode of parasomnia, essentially a waking dream. She prescribed some medication and recommended I switch to day shifts. But I know what I saw, and I'm not the only one. During my suspension, I did some research, spending hours in the city library's archives. It turns out there have been other incidents on that section of the Blue Line. Other drivers who reported strange sightings, mysterious passengers, and inexplicable events. Most of the reports were from years ago, and all were officially explained away or dismissed. I found something else too, an old newspaper article from 1954 describing the Ash Street Station fire. According to the article, the fire started when the last train of the night arrived at the platform. Witnesses reported seeing an elderly woman in dark clothing walking through the cars just before the blaze broke out. She was never identified, and her body was never found. The article included a photo of the platform before it was sealed off. In the background, barely visible through the smoke damage, you can see the Art Deco station sign. And below it, written in smaller letters, "End of the line. All passengers must exit." I'm back at work now, but I requested a transfer to the Green Line. It's a newer route, all modern tunnels and equipment. No abandoned stations, no hidden platforms, no history. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that section of the Blue Line, running deep beneath the old city. I think about that empty platform, waiting in the darkness, and the passengers who might still be waiting there, watching for the last train of the night. And I wonder about that elderly woman, still riding the midnight trains, looking for new passengers to join her at the end of the line. So if you ever find yourself on a late-night train, and you see an old woman in a dark dress sitting alone in an empty car, whatever you do, don't catch her eye. Don't look at her face. And if you hear an announcement for Ash Street Station, close your eyes, keep them closed, and pray that your train doesn't stop. Because sometimes, the end of the line isn't where you think it is. And sometimes, the last train of the night goes places that aren't on any map. I never should have taken that job at Riverside Storage Complex, the graveyard shift at a massive storage facility on the outskirts of town, where the urban sprawl dissolves into abandoned industrial parks and overgrown fields. It was a recipe for disaster from the start. But when you're desperate for work and have a criminal record hanging over your head, you learn to take what you can get. The facility itself was enormous, 5 floors of climate-controlled storage units stretching across 3 buildings, connected by covered walkways and service corridors. During the day, it was busy enough, with people constantly moving things in and out. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely, a maze of identical hallways, metal doors, and shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. My job was simple: patrol the buildings every 2 hours, monitor the security cameras, and make sure nothing unusual happened between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The pay wasn't great, but it came with a small apartment on site. A converted office space on the ground floor of Building C, free rent and utilities were hard to pass up, especially with my background making it difficult to find landlords willing to take a chance on me. The first few weeks were uneventful. The night shift was lonely, but I had gotten used to solitude during my time inside. I spent my hours walking the endless corridors, checking locks, and watching the security feeds. Sometimes I'd hear strange noises, scratching sounds, metallic clangs, or what sounded like whispered conversations. But that was normal in a building this size. The ventilation system played tricks with sound, carrying noises from one end of the facility to the other in ways that could seem unsettling if you thought about it too much. It was during my 3rd month on the job that things started to change. I had just finished my midnight patrol and was back in the security office, going through the camera feeds, when I noticed something odd about Unit 4721 in Building B. The light above the door was flickering, which shouldn't have been possible. The hallway lights were all on the same circuit, and none of the others were affected. I made a note to have maintenance check it in the morning and continued my routine. But as I cycled through the cameras, I kept coming back to that unit. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. I pulled up the facility's database and looked up the unit's rental history. Unit 4721 had been rented by the same person for the past 15 years, a Dr. Marcus Chen. The rental agreement listed him as a research scientist, but provided no other details. His payments were automatic, deducted from an account that never showed any signs of running low. In 15 years, he had accessed the unit exactly once, the day he rented it. I shouldn't have been curious. The cardinal rule of storage facility work is that you don't ask questions about what people store. But something about that single visit in 15 years, combined with that impossibly flickering light, got under my skin. I found myself pulling up more information about Dr. Chun. There wasn't much, just a few old newspaper articles from the local paper. He had worked at a private research facility called Meridian Laboratories, which had shut down abruptly 15 years ago, following what was described as a containment incident. The details were vague, but there had been several deaths, and the facility had been demolished shortly afterward. The timing matched perfectly with when Dr. Chun had rented the storage unit. I knew I should leave it alone. My job was to patrol and observe, not investigate. But during my 2 a.m. rounds, I found myself taking a detour to Building B, 4th floor. The flickering light was still there, casting strange shadows that seemed to move in ways that didn't quite match the rhythm of the flickering. As I approached Unit 4721, the temperature dropped noticeably. In a climate-controlled building, this shouldn't have been possible, but I could see my breath forming clouds in front of me. The metal door looked like all the others, gray, unremarkable, secured with a heavy padlock, but something about it felt wrong. The air around it seemed thicker somehow, as if the space itself was distorted. I stood there for a long moment, listening. At first, there was only the usual ambient noise of the building, the hum of ventilation, the distant drone of the industrial air conditioners. But as I focused, I began to hear something else coming from inside the unit, a low, pulsing sound, just at the edge of hearing. It was like a heartbeat, but not quite organic, with an electrical undertone that made my teeth ache. I should have walked away, should have gone back to my office, finished my shift, and never given Unit 4721 another thought. But instead, I found myself reaching for my master key ring. As security supervisor, I had access to every unit in case of emergencies. We were only supposed to use the keys if we suspected immediate danger to the facility or other renters' property. Looking back, I wish I had remembered that rule. The padlock was ice cold, so cold it almost burned my fingers as I inserted the key. It turned with difficulty, as if something inside the lock was resisting. When it finally clicked open, the sound echoed down the hallway in a way that seemed impossible, reverberating much longer than it should have. I hesitated with my hand on the door handle. The pulsing sound was louder now, and I could feel it in my chest, like a second heartbeat trying to override my own. The flickering light above cast crazy shadows around me, making it seem like the hallway was breathing, expanding, and contracting with each pulse. Common sense screamed at me to stop, to close the lock and walk away. But something else, something deeper and more primitive, pushed me forward. I needed to know what was behind that door. Needed to understand why the air felt wrong, why the light flickered, why Dr. Chun had never returned. I pulled the door open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Ozone and something else. Something chemical and alien that made my sinuses burn. The unit was larger than it should have been. Much larger. Storage units were standard sizes, and this one should have been 10 by 15 feet. But the space in front of me seemed to stretch back into impossible darkness, the walls curving in ways that violated basic geometry. In the center of the room stood what looked like a piece of scientific equipment, a metal framework surrounding a glass cylinder that reached from floor to ceiling. Inside the cylinder was something. It looked like liquid at first, black and oily, but it moved wrong. It flowed upward instead of down, forming patterns and shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. The pulsing sound was coming from it, and now I could see that the liquid was actually pulsing in time with the sound, expanding and contracting like a heart made of living darkness. The walls of the unit were covered in papers, hundreds of pages of scientific notes, diagrams, and equations that made no sense. They were handwritten in increasingly erratic script, the later pages descending into what looked like madness, the equations giving way to desperate warnings and pleas written in multiple languages, some of which didn't look human. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, the liquid in the cylinder noticed me. I don't know how else to describe it. The patterns it was forming suddenly became more focused, more deliberate. It pressed against the glass, forming what looked like a face, or rather, dozens of faces, all trying to emerge at once, all silently screaming. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the metal framework. The pulsing sound changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent. Papers began to flutter on the walls, though there was no wind. And then I saw the cracks in the glass, tiny fissures spreading out from where the liquid pressed against it, forming patterns like black lightning. I backed away, my heart pounding in sync with that awful pulse. As I reached for the door, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, one of the papers detaching from the wall and floating toward me. I grabbed it instinctively, and in the flickering light from the hallway, I could read Dr. Chin's desperate scrawl. "If you're reading this, close the door. Close it now. It's gotten stronger over the years. The containment won't hold much longer. I'm sorry. I thought I could control it, study it, understand it. But it understands us far better than we could ever understand it. And it's so hungry." The glass cylinder cracked louder, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. I slammed the door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the padlock. As I backed away, I could still hear that pulsing sound, but now it was accompanied by something else, a high, thin sound, like laughter but not quite, as if something was trying to remember how humans laugh. I ran back to the security office and pulled up the camera feed for the fourth-floor hallway. The light above Unit 4721 had stopped flickering, but as I watched, a dark liquid began seeping out from under the door. It moved against gravity, flowing up the wall like ink in water, forming those same impossible patterns I had seen in the cylinder. I grabbed my phone to call someone. The police? The FBI? Who do you call when you find something like that? But before I could dial, every light in the facility went out at once. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in red, and every phone line went dead simultaneously. The security monitors showed the black liquid spreading through the building, flowing through vents, under doors, through tiny cracks in the walls. Wherever it went, the security cameras began to fail, one by one, showing only static before going dark. And in that static, just before each camera died, I could see faces forming, desperate, twisted faces that seemed to be trying to warn me, or beg for help, or maybe just scream. I ran, left everything behind and just ran, out of the building and into the night. Behind me, I could hear that sound, that awful, almost laughter, echoing through the facility. As I reached my car, I looked back. In the red glow of the emergency lights, I could see something moving behind every window of the storage complex, something dark and fluid and alive, filling the building like water filling a glass. I drove until I ran out of gas, ending up at a truck stop 50 miles away. When I finally got up the courage to call the police, they found nothing unusual at Riverside Storage Complex. The security cameras showed no sign of malfunction, the lights worked perfectly, and Unit 4721 was empty. Completely empty. No equipment, no papers, nothing but dust. They didn't believe my story, of course. Tests showed traces of carbon monoxide in the building's ventilation system. Not enough to be dangerous, they said, but enough to cause hallucinations. They suggested I seek counseling for work-related stress and recommended I find a new job. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there, whatever it is. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that pulsing sound, still see those patterns forming in the shadows. I've tried to find Dr. Chin, to understand what he created, or discovered, but he seems to have vanished completely after that containment incident 15 years ago. I checked the news obsessively, looking for signs. Strange disappearances, unexplained phenomena, anything that might suggest that thing has gotten loose. So far, nothing. But sometimes, when I'm driving past storage facilities or industrial buildings, I see lights flickering in windows, forming patterns that remind me of that night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see something dark and fluid moving behind those windows, forming faces that seem to recognize me. I've moved 4 times since that night, each time further away from Riverside Storage Complex. But distance doesn't seem to matter. The other night, I woke up to find my bedroom light flickering, casting shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. And in the corner of my room, I saw something that looked like liquid darkness beginning to seep through the wall. I'm writing this as a warning. If you work nights at a storage facility, or anywhere else where the shadows are long and the silence is deep, pay attention to the lights. If you see them flickering in patterns that don't make sense, if you feel the air grow thick and cold, if you hear a sound like a heartbeat that doesn't match your own, run. Run as far and as fast as you can. And if you ever come across Unit 4721, or Dr. Marcus Chen, or anything that moves like liquid but casts shadows like something solid, don't open the door. Don't try to understand it. Just turn around and walk away. Because some things aren't meant to be contained, and some doors aren't meant to be opened. I dream about that unit sometimes. In my dreams, I'm standing in front of that door again, watching black liquid seep through the cracks. But in the dreams, I can hear voices coming from inside. Hundreds of voices, all speaking at once in languages I don't understand. They're trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about what's coming. Because that's the thing about containment, it's never permanent. Everything escapes eventually. And I have a feeling that whatever was in Unit 4721 has been patient, so patient, gradually wearing away at its prison one molecule at a time, spreading through the building's infrastructure, learning, growing stronger. I've started seeing the patterns everywhere now, in water stains on buildings, in oil slicks on puddles, in the way shadows move when you're not looking directly at them. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear that almost laughter again, closer each time. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Watch the shadows in your storage facility, your office building, your home. Watch for patterns that shouldn't be there, for movements that don't follow the rules of physics. And if you ever hear a sound like a heartbeat that isn't yours, or see liquid flowing upward instead of down, or notice lights flickering in ways that make your eyes hurt, don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just close the door, walk away, and pray that whatever Dr. Chin found, whatever he thought he could contain in that unit, never finds its way to where you are. Because some questions shouldn't be answered, some doors shouldn't be opened, and some things should stay locked away forever. But deep down, I know it's too late. Whatever was in Unit 4721 is out there now, spreading, growing, waiting. And sooner or later, it's going to find me. Because once you've seen it, once you've heard that pulse and seen those patterns, it never really lets you go. So if you're thinking about taking that night shift job at a storage facility, my advice is simple: don't. Some things are worth more than a steady paycheck and free rent. And some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because in the end, the true horror isn't what's locked behind those storage unit doors. It's the knowledge that sometimes the doors aren't enough to keep things contained. And sometimes the real nightmare begins not when you open the door, but when you realize that what was behind it has been watching you all along, waiting patiently for someone curious enough or desperate enough to give it the chance it needed to escape. And now it's free. I should have known something was wrong when they offered me the position at Black Rock Lighthouse with barely a glance at my credentials. 6 months of isolation on a remote island 20 miles off the coast, maintaining one of the last manually operated lighthouses in the country. It wasn't the kind of job they usually gave to someone with my limited experience. But I was desperate to escape my life on the mainland, and they were desperate to fill the position after the mysterious disappearance of the previous keeper. The helicopter ride out to Black Rock Island was my first indication of just how isolated the posting would be. Nothing but gray waves in every direction, stretching to a horizon that seemed to blur the boundary between sea and sky. The island itself was little more than a giant rock thrust up from the ocean floor, black volcanic stone worn smooth by centuries of storms, with the lighthouse perched at its highest point like a lone sentinel. Last chance to change your mind. The pilot shouted over the roar of the rotors as we approached. Once I leave, you're here until the supply run next month. Weather permitting, of course. I shook my head, clutching my duffel bag closer. The lighthouse grew larger as we descended, a stark white tower rising 150 feet into the air with a small cluster of buildings at its base. My home for the next 6 months. The pilot helped me unload my supplies and gave me a final warning about the approaching storm system before departing, leaving me alone with the endless sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. The keeper's cottage was small but well maintained, with a kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and a small office filled with logbooks and weather monitoring equipment. Solar panels and a backup generator provided power, and a satellite phone offered emergency communication with the mainland. The lighthouse itself was a marvel of Victorian engineering, its iron spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room at the top. The massive Fresnel lens was a complex array of prisms and mirrors designed to project the light beam up to 20 miles out to sea. My job was simple: keep the mechanism running, maintain the logbooks, and ensure the light stayed on during the night hours. Modern automation handled most of the work, but regulations required a human presence to monitor the systems and perform maintenance. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I fell into a routine, checking the weather instruments, maintaining the equipment, updating the logs. During the day, I explored the island, though there wasn't much to see beyond bare rock and the occasional seabird nest. At night, I would sit in the lantern room, watching the beam sweep across the dark water while listening to the wind howl around the tower. It was during one of these night watches that I first noticed something odd. I was updating the logbook when I heard what sounded like singing, a distant, haunting melody carried on the wind. It was too structured to be the natural sounds of the island, but too alien to be human. When I went to the window to look, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the usual sounds of wind and waves. I might have dismissed it as imagination if not for what happened the next day. While reviewing the previous keeper's logbooks, I found entries describing similar sounds. The entries grew increasingly erratic over time, describing not just singing but strange lights in the water and shapes moving in the darkness beyond the lighthouse beam. The final entry, dated just days before his disappearance, contained a single sentence: "They're not in the water anymore. They're in the walls." That night, the storm the pilot had warned about finally hit. The wind grew fierce enough to shake the entire tower, and waves crashed high enough to spray the lower windows. I was in the lantern room, making sure the light remained stable, when the power went out. The backup generator kicked in immediately, but in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were lights in the water, dozens of them, glowing with a pale blue-green luminescence that couldn't be explained by bioluminescent organisms. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing in some alien script. As I watched, they began to move toward the island, flowing against the current with impossible precision. The generator sputtered, causing the lighthouse beam to flicker. In those moments of darkness, I could see more lights emerging from the depths, and now they were accompanied by shapes, vast, shadowy forms that seemed to shift and change as they moved through the water. The singing started again, louder this time, and with it came a deep thrumming that I could feel in my bones. I grabbed the satellite phone to call for help, but there was only static, punctuated by sounds that might have been words in a language never meant for human tongues. The temperature in the lantern room dropped rapidly, frost forming on the windows despite the summer night. And then I saw them, handprints appearing in the frost, pressed against the glass from the outside. At the top of the lighthouse, 150 feet above the water. The generator failed completely, plunging the lighthouse into darkness. In the sudden quiet, I could hear something moving on the stairs below, a wet, sliding sound accompanied by that same otherworldly singing. The logbook entries flashed through my mind. "They're in the walls." I pulled out my flashlight with trembling hands. The beam seemed weak, as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. Water was seeping up through the floorboards, but it moved wrong, flowing upward instead of down, forming patterns like the lights I'd seen in the ocean. The singing grew louder, and with it came words I could almost understand, almost grasp, if I just listened a little harder. I clamped my hands over my ears, fighting the urge to listen. The previous keeper's final log entry had continued on the next page. I remembered now. The singing. It gets in your head. Makes you want to understand. But once you understand, you're already lost. The temperature dropped further, my breath forming clouds in the beam of the flashlight. The water was halfway up the walls now, defying gravity, and in its shifting patterns I could see faces forming. Not human faces, but something that had perhaps once studied humans and was trying to recreate what it had seen, without quite understanding how faces were supposed to work. I backed away from the spreading water until I hit the railing around the lens. Below, the singing had reached a fever pitch, and I could hear something heavy dragging itself up the spiral staircase. The handprints on the windows multiplied, pressing harder, the glass beginning to crack under the pressure. That's when I saw it reflected in the lens, a shape in the doorway, silhouetted against the darkness. It was roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. It moved like something that had learned about joints and bones from technical diagrams rather than experience, and its proportions seemed to shift and change every time I blinked. It reached out toward me with what might have been a hand, water dripping upward from its fingers to join the impossible patterns flowing across the ceiling. The singing reached a crescendo, and with it came understanding, terrible, mind-shattering understanding of what these things were, where they came from, why they had chosen this remote lighthouse as their point of contact. They were old, so impossibly old. They had been here before the first fish crawled onto land, before the first cells joined together to form complex life. They had slept in the deep places of the ocean, dreaming their alien dreams, until human activity, sonar, deep-sea drilling, underwater testing, had awakened them. And now they were curious about the creatures that had disturbed their slumber. The previous keeper hadn't disappeared. I realized with dawning horror. He had been taken, studied, examined, pulled apart, and put back together by beings trying to understand how humans worked. And now they had come for me. The thing in the doorway took another step forward, its movements like a stick figure animation drawn by someone who had only heard descriptions of how humans walked. The water patterns on the walls began to spiral, forming a vortex that seemed to lead somewhere else, somewhere that light and physics worked differently. The singing had become a physical force, pressing against my mind, trying to pull me into that impossible understanding. In desperation, I turned my flashlight on the creature. For a split second, I saw it clearly, really saw it, and my mind recoiled from what it was seeing. This thing had never been human, never been anything that lived on Earth. It was a probe, a tool, an extension of something vast and unthinkable that waited in the deep, reaching up through miles of ocean to study the strange creatures that lived in the air and light. The flashlight beam seemed to disturb it. It recoiled, its form becoming even more unstable, and the singing took on a different tone. Surprise, perhaps, or pain. I remembered reading somewhere that deep-sea creatures often couldn't handle direct light. Operating on instinct, I began to turn the lighthouse lens, manually rotating it toward the doorway. The beam caught the creature full on, and the effect was immediate and horrifying. Its form began to dissolve, running like wax, while the singing turned into a high-pitched keening that made my ears bleed. The water patterns on the walls recoiled, flowing back down toward the floor, and I heard splashing on the stairs as something heavy retreated rapidly downward. I kept turning the lens, sweeping the beam around the room, driving back the darkness and the things that lived in it. The temperature began to rise, the frost on the windows melting. The handprints faded, and the singing grew more distant, fading back into the sound of wind and waves. The generator suddenly roared back to life, and the lighthouse beam resumed its automatic rotation. I stood there trembling, watching as the lights in the water retreated back into the depths, taking their impossible geometries and alien songs with them. When the supply helicopter arrived a month later, they found me still manning my post. I told them nothing about what had happened. Who would believe me? Instead, I submitted my resignation, citing health reasons. They seemed unsurprised. Apparently few keepers lasted more than a few months at Black Rock Lighthouse. But before I left, I added my own entry to the logbook, hidden in code among mundane observations about weather and equipment maintenance. A warning to the next keeper: if they know how to read it, they're still out there, watching, waiting. They're curious about us, but it's the curiosity of a child pulling wings off insects. They don't understand us, and they want to. They want to understand us so badly. Don't let them. Don't listen to the singing. And always, always keep the light burning. I dream about that night sometimes. In my dreams, I'm back in the lantern room, but this time the light doesn't drive them away. Instead, it reveals them in all their horror, vast shapes rising from the ocean, their geometry an offense to reality itself. They reach for me with limbs that shouldn't exist, while their singing pulls apart my mind, replacing my thoughts with their alien patterns. I've taken a job inland, as far from the ocean as I could get, but sometimes, on rainy nights, I think I hear that singing again, carried on the wind. And sometimes, when I look in mirrors or windows, I see handprints forming in the glass, reaching out from somewhere that isn't quite here, trying to pull me back to that lighthouse and the things that wait in the deep. Because that's the truth about lighthouses. They don't just guide ships away from dangerous waters. Some of them stand guard over places where the boundary between our world and others has grown thin. Places where things that should not exist reach up from the depths, trying to understand the creatures that live in the light. And somewhere out there, off a rocky coast, a lonely lighthouse still sweeps its beam across dark waters, holding back things that were old when the continents were young. Its light keeps burning, night after night, maintained by another keeper who might, even now, be hearing a strange and distant singing carried on the wind. I pray they're stronger than I was. I pray they don't try to understand, because once you understand, you can never stop understanding. And the things you understand will never, ever stop trying to understand you back. Hey there, night owls. I hope these stories kept you on the edge of your seat tonight. If you enjoyed our journey into the darkness, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community of horror fans. We post new terrifying tales every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced anything strange during the night shift. Your story might be featured in our next video. And don't forget to ring that notification bell to be the first to hear our next batch of horror stories. Until then, sleep tight, if you can. See you in the darkness.